The night is already here. The edges of the world have softened, and so, too, may your breath soften with it. Before we begin, take just a moment to feel where you are. Feel the weight of the covers or the quiet air of your room. You've done enough for today. Let go. My name is Duncan. I was born in the year 1592, and though centuries have passed, as silently as snow falling on rooftops, I am still here, still walking through the folds of time, still watching, still remembering. I do not age, not in the way you might imagine. I've lived more than 400 years, and I have seen the rise and fall of empires, the flicker of 1,000 candles in forgotten monasteries, and the quiet genius of people who will never be written into any book. Now, when the world becomes still, I tell stories, soft ones that help you rest. So, if you'd like to hear more of them, I gently invite you to subscribe to this channel. Click the little bell to let the next story find you at just the right time, and leave a comment, if you will. Tell me what kind of story you long to hear. Tell me when you drift into sleep, and in what corner of the world you close your eyes. Now, turn off the light. Let your shoulders fall away from the day. Soften your forehead. Unclench your hands. Let your thoughts melt into mist. And listen to the story of the man who lit the darkness. It was in Philadelphia, sometime in the late 1740s. The city was young, but proud. You could smell horses and wood smoke on the streets. And if you listened closely, you might hear the hum of printers' presses or the crack of a carriage wheel. But this story isn't about those bustling hours. This story unfolds after the shops had closed, after the laughter had died down behind heavy wooden doors. It's a story of what happens when the city exhales and slips into its night skin. That's when he would appear. Not many people knew his name. Even fewer knew where he slept, or if he had a family. But most had seen him, at least once. A man walking slowly from post to post with a long iron rod, pausing beneath the glass globes, mounted on tall wooden poles. Inside each one sat a small, waiting wick, a promise of light. The man would reach up, open the casing with a practiced hand, touch flame to the thread of oil-soaked cloth, and quietly, the darkness would retreat. One lantern at a time. I remember watching him, at first from a distance, then as the nights grew colder and the stars more brittle, from closer and closer still, he walked with care, not because he was slow or frail, but because there was reverence in the task. A kind of intimacy. There's something hauntingly beautiful about a life lived in service to illumination. A life where no one applauds, where no one cheers, but still the light appears. Night after night. He was never late. He never spoke to the lamps, but I sometimes believed he listened to them. One evening, I approached him. I asked if I might walk alongside him for a while. He didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, and together we moved into the hush. He said little at first. We passed rows of shuttered windows and quiet stoops. We walked beneath the sigh of sycamores, shedding their last leaves. The only sound was the soft creak of his boots and the small whoosh as another lantern came alive. Then he spoke. "You ever notice," he said, "how people only look at light, but never the hand that gives it?" It wasn't bitterness in his voice. It was something else, something softer. "Sometimes I wonder," he said, "if we're all lighting things, we'll never get to see clearly." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched the next lamp catch fire. The glass globe glowed like a sun caught in a jar, and I thought of all the lives passing beneath these lights who never wondered how they got there. Take a moment to absorb this. In your own life, how many lanterns have been lit for you without your ever knowing who struck the match? The man and I walked for nearly an hour that night. He spoke of oil deliveries and wind-proofing tricks, of how lanterns flickered differently depending on the season, and how some streets seemed hungrier for light than others. But beneath his words, I sensed something deeper. This wasn't just a man doing a job. This was a man living a rhythm, a quiet, sacred rhythm that Frimpfu would ever understand. He lit the way for others, but walked mostly in shadow himself. And somehow, he was at peace with that. I would walk many nights more with the lantern keeper, and in time, I would come to learn that this quiet soul held thoughts and philosophies as delicate and profound as the flames he coaxed into being. But that is for another evening. For now, let your breath grow slower. Let the lamp light in your mind stay warm and golden. Let yourself drift. There's more to come, but not just yet. Let the darkness rest a little longer, and we'll speak again soon. The second night I walked with him, the fog had returned. It rolled in low from the river, curling between stones and boot prints like a slow, breathing tide. It softened the corners of buildings and swallowed distant footsteps whole. Everything was quieter that evening, as if the city had decided to whisper instead of speak. I found him where I had before, near the old tailor's corner on Market Street, warming his hands over a small tin lamp before beginning his route. He looked up at me and nodded. No words, just a gesture, like we'd done this 100 times before. As we walked, the mist thickened, wrapping itself around our legs and rising to the lanterns, like a cat brushing against familiar furniture. And yet, the keeper moved through it without hesitation. He knew where each post stood, even in the thickest dark. He didn't count steps. He didn't need to see. He simply knew. I asked him how long he had been doing this. He shrugged gently, as if the answer belonged more to the lanterns than to him. Long enough, he said, to see how shadows move. It was a curious answer, and I let the silence stretch. Sometimes you must leave space around a person's words, like placing an empty chair beside them, so their thoughts have somewhere to sit. And after some time, he spoke again. When you walk the same streets for years, he said, but always at night, you start to know them differently. The world hides certain truths in the daylight, but when everything slows down, things begin to reveal themselves. We stopped beside a lantern that had burned too low. He opened the casing with a careful hand and trimmed the wick, coaxing the flame into bloom again. In that small act, the fog shifted, and for just a moment, the world seemed to realign. He continued, "See, during the day, everyone's in motion. People rushing past one another, shouting, buying, building, fighting, forgetting. But at night, all of that disappears. What's left is the pattern underneath. And if you watch long enough, you start to see it." He told me about a cat that visited the same corner every Tuesday, just after midnight. About a widow who always opened her window a crack, even in the cold, so the breeze could find her dreams. About a crooked shutter on Arch Street that had creaked in the same rhythm for 10 years, until one night it stopped. That was the night old Mr. Pruitt passed, he said, almost to himself. He used to lean out that window and listen to it, said it reminded him of his wife's breathing. I listened, but more than that, I watched him as he watched the world. His eyes moved not like a man searching, but like one remembering, like someone returning to something they already knew. There's a kind of knowing that shows only in stillness, a knowledge that doesn't come from study or books, but from repeated presence, from watching the same corner over and over again until even the changes become familiar. Take a moment to absorb this. What if wisdom isn't something you find, but something that finds you? When you stay in one place long enough to be seen back. As we turned onto a narrower street, the fog cleared just enough to see the stars above, faint and watchful. He paused and looked up. "I know when rain is coming," he said, "by how the stars sharpen their edges. When they glow too soft, there's water in the air." And he smiled, not with pride, but with recognition, as if nature had whispered a secret just loud enough for those who'd learned to listen. We moved on. The streets were still. The lanterns behind us burned like little promises. I realized then that this man was not merely lighting the city. He was watching it, not in the way a constable might, looking for crime, but in the way a poet or a gardener might, noticing, tending, memorizing. He had become part of the city's nervous system, its observer, its witness. Most of us rush through life as though the world were a blur. But what would happen if we chose to slow down? If we paid attention long enough for the city, or the world, or our own hearts to speak? As the final lamp was lit on that stretch of road, the fog began to thin. The air grew clearer, sharper, quieter somehow. He turned to me, and in that quiet space, he said something I've never forgotten. "You don't see the city with your eyes," he said. "You see it with your time." And I believed him, not because the words were clever, but because he had lived them. He had traded speed for understanding, and in doing so, he had found something most of us spend a lifetime seeking. He had learned to see. Let that stay with you now. Not as a lesson, not as advice, just as something soft to hold, like a pebble kept in the pocket, warming slowly over time. Rest your thoughts. We'll walk again soon. There is a strange illusion in light. We tend to believe that light reveals everything, as though its presence alone is a kind of truth. But the lantern keeper saw it differently. One evening, as we stood beneath a lantern he had just lit, he didn't move on as usual. Instead, he stared at the wall behind the lamp. The flame flickered gently, and shadows danced quietly against the brick. "There," he said softly. "That's the part people miss." He pointed not to the lantern, but to the shadow it cast. "Light doesn't just show," he said. "It hides." We often think of darkness as the veil, the thing that keeps the world obscured. But what if instead it's light that shapes what we don't see? When a candle is lit in a room, it pulls focus. It centers your eyes, narrows your field. And while you look at the brightness, what's just outside its glow disappears. The keeper had learned this not by theory, but through the rhythm of repetition, lighting thousands of lanterns, watching how people passed through them, never noticing the shadows trailing behind. Shadows, he told me, aren't absence. They're stories. He stepped aside, letting the lantern backlight him. His form became a silhouette, not faceless, but mysterious, like an actor in a play whose role has not yet been revealed. The shadow tells you there's something between the light and the wall, he said. But it doesn't tell you what. It only hints. It suggests. He had come to love this ambiguity, the way shadows refused to give full answers. They left room for mystery, for interpretation, for wonder. And I thought of how we live our lives, how much we claim to know, and how much we assume is fully visible simply because it is lit. But clarity is not always truth, and illumination does not always equal understanding. Sometimes what we most need to know lives just beyond the edge of the visible. He told me that he often imagined the lantern light as a kind of voice, not a loud one, never loud, but a whispering one, curling into corners and slipping under doorways. Each lamp, he believed, had its own way of speaking. Some lights hummed like lullabies. Others shimmered nervously, as though uncertain of their place. But all of them, every single one, spoke in tandem with shadow, not in opposition to it. This was his quiet philosophy, that light and shadow are not enemies, but partners. One reveals shape, the other reveals form. One sharpens edges, the other softens them. He believed that wisdom lived in the place where the two met, in the flickering borderlands where a thing is not fully known, but not fully hidden either. Take a moment to absorb this. How many of your own truths have lived in shadow? How many feelings or memories have remained half lit, half seen? Not because they were false, but because they were too layered to be exposed in the harshness of full light. We often fear shadow. We treat it like a threat, as if anything not seen in perfect clarity must be dangerous. But the lantern keeper didn't think so. He thought shadow was protective, gentle, honest even, because it never pretended to be complete. I remember one moment especially. We passed a storefront window where a broken mirror leaned against the sill. The lantern light hit it at an angle, casting fragmented beams against the opposite wall. Each shard of reflection danced with its own small pattern, scattered, imperfect, but together they lit the alley in a way no single flame could. "There," he whispered. "That's what I mean." He didn't point to the brightest glow. He pointed to the strange geometry the shadows made. Soft triangles, long curves, overlapping silhouettes. It wasn't clarity he admired. It was complexity. It was suggestion. It was the invitation to wonder. I asked him once if he ever wished for brighter lanterns, ones that could pierce further, expose more. He shook his head. "There's a danger in too much light," he said. "When you see everything, you stop looking." And so he kept his lamps low, not out of stinginess or old habit, but out of respect for the mystery of night. He believed people needed space to dream, and that overlit places, like over-explained thoughts, leave no room for the imagination to stretch. Now and then, when I walk modern streets with their humming lamps and halogen eyes, I think of him. I think of how he'd let some corners remain dark on purpose, not to frighten, but to offer comfort, a place where the mind could wander and not be watched. So tonight, if you find yourself lying in a room where one corner is darker than the rest, let it be. Let it be quiet. Let it be curious. Let it hold whatever doesn't need to be solved. Because not everything is meant to be revealed. Not everything is meant to be clear. Some things speak best from the shadow, and only those who walk slowly, who light the way with reverence, will hear what the darkness has to say. Sleep now. You've seen enough light for one evening. Let your breath dim gently as the shadows deepen. The night we spoke of time, the sky was especially clear. You could see the curve of the stars with a kind of gentle sharpness, as though someone had swept the heavens clean. There was no wind that evening, only stillness. Stillness so deep it made the sound of the keeper's steps feel like punctuation in a sentence whispered by the city itself. He had just finished lighting a lantern outside the old clockmaker's shop, a place I'd passed countless times. It always smelled faintly of cedar and oil. The lantern keeper paused and looked through the shop's darkened window. And then, without turning toward me, he said, "Time is a strange companion. It stays close when you're not looking, and runs off the moment you try to catch it." I stood beside him in silence. The clocks in the window, dozens of them, each with different faces, all unmoving in the dark, looked like they were listening. "I don't wear a watch," he said softly. "Never have." And of course, he didn't need one. His life followed rhythms older than seconds, and sharper than minutes. He lived by the pace of dusk, the stretch of shadows, the feel of dew forming on stone. Some nights, he told me, he could tell the hour just by the scent in the air. The city itself shifted, its breath, its temperature, its heartbeat, and the keeper, patient and constant, moved in time with it. Time, for him, was not a number. It was a feeling, a rhythm. He told me that when he was younger, he had tried to measure time like everyone else, with bells and sand and ticking hands. But it had made him anxious. He had always felt behind or ahead, never with it. So he stopped. He let the clocks belong to other people. Instead, he began to trust repetition, the kind that speaks without speaking, like the way shadows return to the same wall each night, or how the birds outside the baker's window always stirred just before dawn. He said that after many years, he realized he hadn't aged in the way others did. Not because his body stayed young, it didn't, but because time had stopped rushing him. It no longer chased him, and he no longer fled. It's easy to believe that time is something we must conquer, that every day must be filled to the brim with doing. But there was a quiet defiance in the keeper's simplicity, as if by walking the same path again and again, he had carved a kind of stillness into the shape of the world. I asked him if he ever grew tired of the route, the same streets, the same corners, year after year. He shook his head. Most people think repetition is boring, he said. But it's how the world speaks. The tide returns. The moon wanes. The wheat bends. He paused, then added with a faint smile, even your heartbeat, it only matters because it repeats. He was right, of course. We're surrounded by repetition. The seasons, the breath, the sun rising and falling in its ancient arc. But we rarely honor it. Instead, we chase novelty, believing that newness alone brings meaning. And yet, take a moment to absorb this. What if meaning lives not in the new, but in the familiar? What if the daily act, done with attention, is where the soul resides? The keeper found peace in returning, lighting the same lamp, turning the same key, walking the same line of cobblestones, not because he was stuck, but because he was present. He had, over time, become like the lanterns themselves, a small, steady pulse in the dark. There's something sacred in that, in showing up again and again, even when no one sees you, even when no one knows. He didn't mark the years in birthdays or calendars. He marked them by the things that changed slowly. A new vine growing on the wall behind the mill. A child who had once waved from a window, no longer appearing there, time had become a companion to him, not a ruler. And when he spoke of it, he never used the word lost. To him, no time was lost if it was lived with care. And that stayed with me. Even now, when I walk through cities brighter and faster than the Philadelphia we knew, I sometimes pause at a street light and try to feel the rhythm underneath. The slow, old music most people don't hear anymore. Maybe you feel it too, in the way your cat moves toward the window at the same hour, in how your breath slows as the evening deepens, in the quiet things you return to because they bring you back to yourself. Not everything has to move quickly. Some things, the most important things, move in circles. And when they do, they become timeless. So let time soften for you now. Let your body feel heavy in all the right ways. You don't need to measure this moment. Just let it pass gently through you, like footsteps on a path worn smooth by return. The lantern keeper's fingers had grown slower, not clumsy, never that, but slower, more deliberate, like an artist who knows each stroke of the brush might be his last. It had been many years since our first walk together, and though time moved differently for me than it did for him, I could still feel its soft insistence brushing against him, tugging at his coat, slowing his stride, curling silver at his temples. One evening, as he lit the last lantern of a narrow lane, he lingered. The flame took quickly, a small, obedient bloom. He didn't move away, though. He stayed, watching the glass glow war against the night, his breath a faint cloud in the cooling air. Then, as though continuing a conversation we hadn't started, he said, "One day, I won't be here to light them." I didn't reply. Sometimes silence is the only answer that honors a moment, and he, of all people, understood the value of silence. "But someone will," he continued. "Or maybe not someone. Maybe it'll be something. But the light will come one way or another." He smiled then, just barely. It wasn't melancholy. It was peace. The kind of peace that grows in a person who has made peace with impermanence. He told me there was a boy, a curious one, who had begun to follow him in the early evenings, just as I once had, not to talk, not to play, just to walk and watch. "He hasn't asked anything yet," the keeper said, "but he's listening, I can tell." And that's how it often begins, isn't it? Legacy isn't a torch passed with ceremony. It's a quiet rhythm, repeated often enough to become instinct. It's someone watching your hands and later imitating them in the privacy of their own quiet. It's the warmth of a lantern someone else once lit, still glowing long after they're gone. The lantern keeper said he didn't mind if no one remembered his name. "I'm not the story," he said. "The light is." That stayed with me. So many people chase legacy like it's something to be won. A statue, a street, a signature in history. But he saw it differently. Legacy, to him, was what remained useful in the dark, what still brought warmth, long after the hand that lit it had vanished. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted the streets to stay lit. That was enough. Take a moment to absorb this. What kind of light do you leave behind? What small flame might someone walk by, not knowing it came from your hands? We forget sometimes how much the world relies on quiet caretakers, those who do their work without applause, without reward, without needing to be seen. But without them, everything dims. Perhaps you are one of them. Perhaps your work, your kindness, your care has gone unnoticed by the loud and hurried world. But it has not been lost. There are people walking safer paths because of you. There are moments of comfort that only exist because you lit them. There are shadows made gentler by the shape of your patience. You may never see the full extent of what you've given, but the lantern keeper would tell you, you don't have to. The light doesn't belong to the one who lit it. It belongs to everyone it touches. And now, I don't know what became of him. He grew older, yes, and eventually his steps slowed until they stopped. But somewhere in that city, maybe even now, a hand is still striking flint. A lamp is still catching fire, and the night is still becoming warm. Perhaps it's the boy, or perhaps it's the rhythm itself, carrying forward as all true things do, not through force, but through return. So, if you walk some evening through a quiet street, and a lantern lights just before you pass it, know that you are not alone. Someone, somewhere, once made sure you would not walk in darkness. And if this story has found a small light inside you, a warm place in your breath as you drift, then I gently invite you. Subscribe to this channel. Click the little bell so the next quiet tale might find you just when you need it. And if you'd like to leave a word below, tell me what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Tell me what time you usually drift to sleep, and what part of the world you do it from. Your words, like lanterns, help me find my way back to you. Now rest. The flame is lit. The path is clear. You've wandered far enough for one evening. Have a good rest. Good night.